Dust motes danced in the shaft of sterile fluorescent light, settling on the crumpled pharmacy receipt left on a diner table. He had walked away without looking back, leaving behind a scent of burnt ozone and a silence that swallowed the rest of Rowan's youth. 4 years later, it wasn't fate that dragged them back together. It was a spilled cup of cheap coffee, a tired Omega with cracked hands, and a little boy looking up with a pair of eyes Conrad had spent years trying to forget. His own, the zipper on the canvas duffel bag caught, snagging on a frayed thread. It made a sharp, metallic screech that tore through the heavy silence of the bedroom. Rowan stood in the doorway, his shoulder pressed against the cheap plaster frame. He didn't offer to help. He just watched Conrad's broad shoulders shift under his cotton shirt as he yanked the zipper back, forced it over the snag, and locked it closed. "I'll have the rest of my boxes shipped once I find a permanent place in Chicago," Conrad said. His voice was entirely conversational. That was the worst part. There was no screaming, no shattered plates, no venom, just a quiet, suffocating efficiency. Conrad's scent, usually a crisp, grounding wave of dry pine and clean earth, had turned sharp. It smelled like ozone, like the metallic tang of the air right before a power line snapped. It was the scent of an alpha who had completely, utterly detached himself from his environment. Rowan swallowed. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. In the right pocket of his faded jeans, his fingers were clamped around a small plastic stick. The edge of it dug into his thumb, a physical anchor keeping him from floating away into the buzzing static in his head. 2 pink lines. He had taken the test 3 hours ago, throwing up generic brand ginger ale into the porcelain bowl before sitting on the bath mat until his legs went numb. "Conrad," Rowan started. His voice cracked. It sounded small, pathetic. He hated it. Conrad paused, his hand still resting on the handle of the duffel bag. He didn't turn around. "Rowan, don't. Please. We've talked this to death." "We haven't talked at all. You just came home and started packing." Finally, Conrad turned. His face was a mask of exhausted patience. He was 25, but in the dim light of their cramped apartment, the harsh lines around his mouth made him look a decade older. His eyes, a startling icy slate gray with a dark limbal ring, were entirely empty. There was no warmth left in them, no memory of Sunday mornings tangled in the sheets, no echo of the times he had buried his face in Rowan's neck and inhaled the sweet cedar and honey scent of his Omega. Now Rowan's scent was sour, curdled honey and fear. "I got the promotion," Conrad said, his voice flat. "It requires relocation, and even if it didn't, look around, Ro. Look at us." He gestured vaguely to the room, the unmade bed, the stack of unpaid electric bills on the dresser, the tension hanging so thick in the air it was hard to draw breath. "We're bleeding each other dry. I'm suffocating here. You're unhappy. We're just dragging out the inevitable because we're too scared to pull the plug." "I'm not unhappy," Rowan lied. The words tasted like ash. "You're empty," Conrad corrected, brutally accurate. "And I'm tired. I want a career. I want a life that doesn't feel like I'm drowning in this." "In me," Rowan thought. The plastic stick felt heavier in his pocket. "He means he's drowning in me." Rowan's thumb rubbed frantically against the smooth plastic. He had rehearsed the words in the bathroom. "I'm pregnant. We're having a baby. It's going to be okay." But looking at Conrad now, looking at the rigid set of his jaw, the absolute finality in his posture, the words died in his lungs. Conrad didn't want this life. He certainly didn't want a child. If Rowan spoke now, he would be doing exactly what Conrad feared most, dropping a cage over his head. An alpha's duty might force Conrad to stay, his biology demanding he provide for a pregnant mate, but his eyes would rot with resentment. Rowan would watch him slowly hate the child, and hate Rowan for chaining him to a life he was desperate to escape. Rowan's pride, battered and bruised as it was, flared to life. It was a cold, ugly thing, but it was all he had left. He let go of the plastic stick. He pulled his hand out of his pocket and crossed his arms over his chest, shivering despite the July heat pressing against the apartment windows. "Fine," Rowan said. His voice was suddenly steady, hollowed out. "If you're going, then go." Conrad's expression flickered, a microscopic crack in the ice. Maybe he had expected begging. Maybe, somewhere deep down, his alpha instincts balked at the ease of the severance. But the ambition, the relentless drive that had always defined him, won out. "It's for the best," Conrad muttered, grabbing the bag. He walked toward the door, pausing just a few inches from Rowan. The sheer physical presence of him made Rowan's stomach twist violently. The urge to lean in, to bare his neck and submit to the scent, to beg him to stay, was a physical agony. Rowan bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper. "Take care of yourself, Rowan," Conrad said. He walked through the door. He didn't look back. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. The deadbolt rattled slightly. Rowan stood in the doorway for a long time. The smell of ozone faded, replaced by the scent of stale air and cheap carpet cleaner. He slowly sank to the floor, his back scraping against the doorframe, until he was sitting on the scuffed hardwood. He pulled the plastic stick from his pocket and stared at the two pink lines until they blurred into one solid bloody streak of color. The alarm clock didn't buzz. It rattled against the particle board nightstand like a dying insect. Rowan slammed his hand over the snooze button at 4:30 a.m. The digital red numbers glared at him in the suffocating pitch black of the studio apartment. He lay there for exactly 60 seconds, listening to the rhythmic, shallow breathing coming from the small cot pushed against the opposite wall. His back ached. A dull, throbbing knot sat permanently between his shoulder blades, a souvenir of hauling 50-pound bags of flour and sugar for the past 3 years. He rolled over, the springs of the second-hand mattress groaning in protest, and forced himself up. The floor was freezing. Rowan shivered in his worn t-shirt, padding quietly into the tiny kitchenette. Before he even put the kettle on, he reached into the medicine cabinet over the sink. He peeled the backing off a thick, flesh-colored patch and slapped it hard against the scent gland on his neck. The blocker stung. It always stung. A sharp chemical burn that seeped into his skin, suppressing his natural pheromones. He hadn't smelled his own cedar and honey scent in 4 years. Now he smelled like nothing, like chalk dust and sterile alcohol. It was safer that way. A single unbonded Omega in this part of the city was a target. An Omega smelling of distress and exhaustion was chum in the water. Rowan flipped the switch on the cheap coffee maker. As it began to spit and hiss, he turned back to look at the cot. The blanket had been kicked off. Libby was sprawled on his stomach, one arm dangling over the edge, fingers curled into a loose fist. He was small for a 4-year-old, his limbs thin and knobby, but he had a quiet resilience that broke Rowan's heart daily. Rowan walked over and pulled the quilt back up over the boy's shoulders. Libby stirred, his face turning toward the dim light of the kitchen. His eyes fluttered open. Even after 4 years, it was a shock to the system. The rest of Libby was a perfect mix of them both. Rowan's soft, chaotic brown hair, the gentle slope of his nose, but his eyes were a violently exact replica of the man who had walked away. They were that same piercing, icy slate gray, ringed in a dark, bruised slate. They didn't look like a child's eyes. They were too observant, too ancient. "Morning, Bug," Rowan whispered, his voice raspy. Libby blinked slowly, rubbing a tiny fist against his cheek. "Is it dark time or light time?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Still dark time," Rowan said, brushing a curl from Libby's forehead. "But we gotta go. Mama Lou needs us." Libby didn't complain. He rarely did. It was an unnatural compliance born out of living in tiny spaces and absorbing his father's permanent state of stress. He simply sat up, shivering slightly in the cool air, and let Rowan dress him in a faded yellow sweater and corduroy pants. An hour later, they were on the D-Line bus. The city was just beginning to bruise purple in the east. The bus smelled of wet wool, stale beer, and exhaust. Rowan held Libby in his lap, the boy's head resting against his chest, fast asleep again. Rowan stared out the grease-streaked window, watching the neon signs of the industrial district blur past. He was tired. It wasn't the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was a bone-deep cellular exhaustion. The exhaustion of calculating whether he could afford the electric bill or a new pair of winter boots for Libby. The exhaustion of smiling at rude customers, of hiding his nature, of existing solely as a machine to keep his son alive. They got off at 6th and Main. Lou's Diner and Bakery was a decaying relic squeezed between a pawn shop and a shuttered hardware store. Rowan unlocked the back door, the familiar scent of rancid grease and bleach washing over him. It was a disgusting smell, but it was safe. It meant a paycheck. He set Libby up in corner booth number 4, out of the way of the kitchen swing doors. He wiped down the cracked red vinyl, gave Libby a stack of napkins and a box of dull crayons, and set a small glass of milk on the table. "Stay here, bud. Don't go near the counter," Rowan instructed, tying a stained white apron around his waist. Libby nodded, already peeling the paper off a blue crayon. "Okay, Papa." The morning rush hit at 7 a.m. It was a chaotic blur of yelling orders, burning toast, and the relentless clatter of cheap silverware against thick ceramic mugs. Rowan moved like a ghost behind the counter, pouring black coffee until his wrist ached, his face set in a carefully blank expression. He ignored the leering stares from the construction workers, the sharp snaps of impatient businessmen, and the throbbing in his lower back. By 10:30 a.m., the rush had died down. The diner was mostly empty, smelling heavily of fried bacon and burned sugar. Rowan leaned against the back counter, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm, breathing hard. From the corner booth, he heard a quiet scraping sound. He glanced over. Libby was intensely focused on drawing a lopsided blue dog on a napkin. Rowan felt a sudden, fierce tightening in his chest, a protective rush so violent it made him slightly nauseous. He poured a fresh glass of water, intending to take it over to the boy, when the little bell above the diner's front door jingled sharply. Rowan didn't look up immediately. He grabbed a damp rag and began wiping the counter. "Just grab any seat, I'll be right with you," he called out, his voice slipping into its practiced, monotone customer service drone. There was no answer. No sound of footsteps moving toward a booth, just a sudden, suffocating shift in the air pressure of the room. Conrad Hill hated this part of the city. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, stepping carefully over a suspicious dark stain on the cracked sidewalk. The air here tasted like diesel and despair. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled glass tower in Chicago, where he had spent the last 4 years clawing his way to junior partner at the firm. He was only in town for a day, a real estate acquisition. The firm was buying up this block of rotting storefronts to bulldoze and replace with luxury mixed-use condos. It was a ruthless move, displacing a dozen local businesses, but Conrad didn't care. He was paid not to care. He was paid to be a shark. He checked his Patek Philippe watch. 10:35 a.m. The meeting with the zoning board wasn't until noon. He needed coffee. Not the sludge they served in the firm's break room, but actual strong coffee. He looked up and saw the faded, buzzing neon sign, Lou's Diner. It looked like a health code violation waiting to happen, but it was open. Conrad pushed the heavy glass door open. The bell above it chimed, a cheery, irritating sound. The inside of the diner was exactly what he expected. Dingy linoleum, sticky red booths, the overwhelming smell of old frying oil. "Just grab any seat, I'll be right with you," a voice called from behind the counter. Conrad froze. The voice was rough, tired, lacking any inflection. But the cadence, the subtle dip in pitch at the end of the sentence. Conrad's heart performed a strange, violent stutter against his ribs. He stood perfectly still on the entrance mat. His alpha instincts, usually buried under layers of corporate civility and expensive cologne, violently flared to life. The hair on his arms stood up. He inhaled sharply. The diner smelled awful. Bleach, grease, old meat. But underneath it, buried beneath the chemical stench, was a ghost. A faint, nearly imperceptible trace of something sweet. It was degraded, smothered by scent blockers, but it hit the back of Conrad's throat like a physical blow. Cedar and honey. Conrad slowly lowered his gaze from the tin ceiling tiles. He looked toward the counter. A man was standing there, facing away, wiping down the stainless steel with a rag. He was thin, too thin. His spine was a visible ridge against his cheap gray t-shirt. His shoulders were slumped, holding a tension that looked permanently baked into his muscles. Conrad's mouth went dry. He tried to take a step forward, but his leather Oxfords felt nailed to the floorboards. Before he could speak, a small sound caught his attention. To his left, in the corner booth, something dropped to the floor. A blue crayon rolled across the scuffed linoleum, coming to a stop just an inch from the toe of Conrad's polished shoe. Conrad looked down at the crayon, then slowly looked up at the booth. A little boy was sitting there. He was small, wearing a faded yellow sweater that was pilling at the elbows. He had messy, chaotic brown hair. The boy slipped out of the booth, his small sneakers hitting the floor without a sound. He crouched down to pick up the crayon. As he grabbed it, he paused. He tilted his head back to look at the towering man in the expensive suit standing in front of him. Conrad looked down. The breath was punched entirely out of his lungs. He stumbled back half a step, his heel catching on the edge of the floor mat. The boy's eyes. They weren't brown. They weren't blue. They were icy, slate gray, pale, piercing, and ringed with a dark, bruised rim. They were a genetic anomaly. They were staring up at Conrad with an eerie, quiet intelligence that mirrored the expression Conrad saw in the mirror every single morning while tying his silk ties. Conrad's stomach dropped into a bottomless gorge. The world tilted violently on its axis. The roaring in his ears drowned out the hum of the refrigerators. "Here," the boy said softly, holding up the blue crayon, thinking perhaps the tall man had dropped it. Conrad couldn't speak. His throat was locked. A sudden, terrifying rush of pheromones flooded his system, sharp, panicked pine and ozone pouring off him in waves. His alpha biology was screaming at him, recognizing something his logical brain was desperately trying to reject. Mine. The instinct was so loud, so primal, it made Conrad dizzy. Blood. Lineage. Mine. "Libby, I told you not to get up." The voice from the counter snapped the frozen tableau. Conrad snapped his head up. Rowan had turned around. The damp rag was slipping from his hand. For a second, the diner ceased to exist. There was only the space between them, thick and heavy with 4 years of buried ghosts. Rowan looked terrible. The soft, glowing youth Conrad remembered was entirely gone. Rowan's face was hollowed out, dark purple bruises blooming under his eyes. His skin looked sallow, deprived of sunlight and rest. There was a thick, ugly blocker patch slapped hastily over his scent gland. Rowan's eyes widened. The rag hit the floor with a wet slap. All the color drained from Rowan's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked from Conrad, down to Libby, and back to Conrad. Panic. Absolute feral panic exploded in Rowan's eyes. He moved faster than Conrad thought possible. Rowan vaulted over the low counter, his boots skidding dangerously on the greasy linoleum. He lunged toward the corner booth, grabbing Libby by the back of his sweater and yanking the boy roughly behind his legs, shielding him entirely from Conrad's view. "Get away from him," Rowan snarled. It wasn't a request. It was an animalistic threat. Rowan's scent blocker couldn't hold back the sudden flood of sheer terror. The scent of sour, burned honey and rotting cedar flooded the small diner, gagging Conrad with the intensity of the Omega's distress. Conrad raised his hands, a placating gesture, though his own hands were shaking violently. "Rowan!" he choked out. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Rowan! Is that a... Don't!" Rowan spat, backing up, pushing Libby further into the corner with his calves. His chest was heaving. He looked like a cornered stray dog ready to tear out a throat. Don't you dare say a word. Don't you look at him. Get out. Ro, wait. Conrad took a half step forward. I said get out, Rowan screamed. The raw volume of it echoed off the tin ceiling, making Libby whimper softly and clutch at the back of Rowan's jeans. Conrad froze. The air between them was toxic. It was heavy with 4 years of poverty, of lonely nights, of brutal, exhausting survival that Rowan had endured alone. Conrad looked at the worn-out clothes, the cheap scent blocker, the terror in the eyes of the person he used to hold while they slept. Then he looked at the small hand gripping Rowan's jeans. I'm suffocating here. You're empty. We're bleeding each other dry. The echoes of his own words from 4 years ago rang in his skull. He had walked away to build an empire, leaving his mate behind to rot. He had been so blind, so obsessed with not being trapped, that he had abandoned his own blood to scrub grease off a diner floor. Conrad's knees felt weak. The ruthless, untouchable junior partner was gone, shattered into a million pieces on the dirty floor of a rundown bakery. Rowan? Conrad whispered, a single tear cutting a hot path down his cheek, ruining the cold facade he had spent years perfecting. What have I done? Rowan's fingers cramped as he gripped the edge of a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the counter. He didn't realize he had grabbed it until the thick handle dug into his palm. It was a stupid weapon. It wouldn't stop a grown alpha if it came to violence, but Rowan's brain wasn't processing logic. It was purely reptilian. Threat, defend, survive. Behind his legs, Libby was impossibly quiet. The boy had buried his face into the denim of Rowan's jeans, his small hands clutching the fabric tight enough to pull the seams. I'm warning you, Rowan said. His voice was no longer a scream. It had dropped into a low, vibrating register that scraped his own throat raw. Walk out that door right now, or I swear to God I will cave your face in and let the cops sort it out. Conrad stood paralyzed near the entrance mat. The immaculate charcoal suit suddenly looked ridiculous on him, like a child playing dress-up in a war zone. His chest heaved, pulling in jagged, uneven breaths. The suffocating scent of ozone and panic pouring off him was making Rowan's head spin. It was an assault on the senses, triggering a biological submission reflex Rowan had spent 4 years starving to death. His knees threatened to buckle, but the weight of the boy against his calves locked his joints in place. He's 4, Conrad choked out. The math was simple, brutal, and completely devastating. He stared at Rowan's hollowed-out face, mapping the exhaustion etched around his eyes. When I left, you were already... Shut your mouth, Rowan hissed, slamming the ceramic mug against the stainless steel counter. The sharp crack echoed through the empty diner. You don't get to do the math. You don't get to ask questions. You forfeited that right when you packed your bags because I was too inconvenient for your career. Conrad flinched. It wasn't a subtle twitch. His entire body jerked as if he had been physically struck. He raised a trembling hand, reaching out across the greasy linoleum. It was an empty, pathetic gesture. Ro, please, I didn't know. It wouldn't have mattered, Rowan fired back, his tone venomous, precise. You said I was empty. You said I was bleeding you dry. You think a baby would have fixed that? You would have looked at him every day and hated him for keeping you in that apartment. I saved him from you. The words hit Conrad like a firing squad. He staggered back a half step. His heel bumped against the heavy glass of the front door. From the swinging doors of the kitchen, an older woman with a hairnet and arms thick from kneading dough pushed her way through. Lou wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, her eyes darting from Rowan's defensive crouch to the suited man at the door. As a beta, she couldn't smell the chaotic pheromone warfare choking the room, but she could read the violence in Rowan's posture. Hey, Lou barked, pointing a wooden spatula at Conrad. You ordering or are you loitering? Because if you're bothering my cook, I got a rolling pin with your name on it. Conrad slowly turned his head to look at Lou. His slate-gray eyes were entirely hollow. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash and hadn't realized his legs were missing. He looked back at Rowan. Rowan held his gaze, his chin tipped down, the mug still raised. There was no wavering in the Omega's eyes, only absolute, fortified hatred. "I'll go," Conrad whispered. He backed up, fumbling blindly for the brass handle of the door. He pushed it open, the cheery bell mocking the silence of the room. "I'll go, but I'm not leaving. Not again." Rowan didn't respond. He just watched as the heavy glass door shut, cutting off the sharp scent of alpha pine. The moment Conrad's figure disappeared past the pawn shop window, the adrenaline evaporated from Rowan's bloodstream, leaving behind a terrifying vacuum. The ceramic mug slipped from his numb fingers, shattering into large, jagged shards on the floor. Rowan dropped to his knees right into the mess. He ignored the sting of ceramic slicing into his knee through his jeans. He grabbed Libby, pulling the small boy into his chest, burying his face in the faded yellow sweater. "Papa?" Libby whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He patted Rowan's back with awkward, stiff hands. "Why was that man crying?" Rowan squeezed his eyes shut, a dry, agonizing sob tearing its way up his throat. He squeezed his son tighter, inhaling the smell of cheap laundry detergent and childhood. "He's just lost, Bug," Rowan lied, rocking them both on the dirty floor. "Just a lost man. He won't bother us anymore." He pressed a hand to his own neck. Underneath the flesh-colored patch, his scent gland was burning, painfully inflamed from the sudden, violent surge of suppressed pheromones. The safety he had painstakingly built over 4 years was gone. The wolf was at the door. 50 floors above the street, the air was heavily filtered and smelled faintly of expensive ozone and lemon polish. Conrad sat on the edge of the king-sized mattress in his luxury suite at the Four Seasons. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the aggressive midday sun. The only light came from the glowing screen of his laptop resting on the glass coffee table. He hadn't made it to the zoning meeting. He had called his managing partner from the back of a black car, claiming food poisoning. It wasn't entirely a lie. The moment the car doors had closed, sealing him inside the leather interior, Conrad had violently thrown up his morning espresso into a discreet paper bag. Now he stared at his hands. They were shaking. They had been shaking for 3 hours. His suit jacket lay crumpled on the carpet. His silk tie was violently loosened. The crisp white collar of his shirt felt like a garrote around his throat. "I saved him from you." Rowan's voice played on a continuous, torturous loop in his skull. Conrad leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and dug the heels of his hands into his eyes until bursts of color exploded in the darkness. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the expensive hotel room apart. But mostly, he wanted to peel his own skin off. He was an alpha, biologically wired to provide, to protect, to build a safe structure for his family. And instead, he had abandoned a pregnant mate to scrub grease off a diner floor while he drank $300 bottles of scotch at corporate dinners. Conrad dragged his hands down his face and reached for his phone. He unlocked it and pulled up a contact. David Miller, Private Investigations. He used David for corporate espionage, background checks on rival CEOs, digging up dirt on zoning commissioners. He hit dial. It rang twice. "Hill, what do you need?" David's voice was crisp, professional. "I need a comprehensive background pull," Conrad said. His voice sounded dead. "Financial, medical, housing history, everything for the last 48 months. Target. Rowan Parker." Conrad swallowed hard. "And any dependents listed under his name." "Give me 2 hours," David said, and hung up. It took 84 minutes. When the encrypted file landed in his inbox, Conrad hesitated. His finger hovered over the trackpad. Opening this file meant looking at the receipt for his ambition. It meant seeing the exact cost of his freedom. He clicked open. It was worse than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a story of a single parent struggling. It was a brutal, agonizing ledger of survival. Conrad scrolled through the pages, the blue light of the screen illuminating the horror on his face. Medical records. Rowan had delivered at a county hospital. No private room, no alpha listed on the birth certificate. just a horrifying note from the attending physician documenting severe malnutrition and maternal distress during a 30-hour labor. Housing records. 3 different addresses in 4 years. The first was an eviction. The landlord had kicked them out when Libby was 6 months old because Rowan couldn't make the rent. The subsequent addresses got progressively worse, pushing them further into the decaying industrial skirts of the city. Financials. The bank statements were a joke, a cruel, sick joke. Rowan's checking account rarely held more than $40 at a time. The deposits from Lou's diner were agonizingly small. The withdrawals were entirely utilities, cheap groceries, and... Conrad paused, zooming in on a recurring monthly charge. Apothecary Direct. $60 a month. It took a second for Conrad to realize what it was. Industrial-grade scent blockers. Rowan was spending a significant percentage of his miserable income to chemically burn his own scent away, to hide from alphas, to hide from the world. Because the only alpha he had ever trusted had walked out the door and never looked back. Conrad pushed the laptop away. The glass table scraped loudly against the metal base. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, looking down at the sprawling concrete grid of the city. Down there, somewhere in the smog and the grit, his son was wearing a sweater that was falling apart, drawing with broken crayons on cheap napkins. A heavy, suffocating weight settled in Conrad's chest. It wasn't just guilt. It was a terrifying, absolute certainty. His life in Chicago was over. The junior partnership, the corner office, the penthouse apartment, it all tasted like ash. None of it mattered. The empire he had built was a monument to his own cowardice. He couldn't just write a check. Rowan would set it on fire. He couldn't just walk back into that diner and demand custody. Rowan would likely stab him with a steak knife, and the courts would probably help him hide the body. Rowan had built a fortress of hatred to protect himself and their son, and Conrad was the monster kept outside the gates. Conrad pulled his phone out again. He dialed his managing partner's number. "Conrad!" The voice boomed through the speaker. "Feeling better? The zoning board is breathing down our necks. We need to push the acquisition of that block by Friday." Conrad looked at the file on his screen. The block they were acquiring. The block they were tearing down. The block that housed a rotting little diner called Lou's. "Cancel the acquisition," Conrad said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Excuse me?" "Conrad, we have millions tied up in—" "I said cancel it, Richard," Conrad interrupted, "and consider this my resignation. I'm not coming back to Chicago." He hung up the phone before the partner could respond. He tossed the phone onto the unmade bed and stared at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The ruthless, ambitious alpha stared back at him. He had a lot of work to do. He had to dismantle his entire life, piece by piece, and figure out how to crawl over broken glass to get back to the family he had destroyed. Tuesday tasted like copper and old coffee grounds. Rowan spent 72 hours waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. He waited for a fleet of black SUVs to pull up to the diner. He waited for a sleazy corporate lawyer in a silk tie to hand him a pristine manila envelope full of custody papers. He jumped every time the front door bell jingled, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The blocker patch on his neck was red and peeling at the edges, the skin underneath violently inflamed from his constant scratching. But the lawyers never came. The police didn't show up to serve a warrant. Instead, at 6 a.m. on Wednesday, the bell chimed, and a single man walked in. Rowan dropped a metal spatula onto the flat-top grill. The grease popped, spitting a hot drop of oil onto his wrist, but he didn't flinch. Conrad didn't look like a junior partner anymore. The bespoke charcoal suit was gone, replaced by a faded gray Henley shirt, dark denim jeans, and scuffed work boots. His hair, usually styled with ruthless precision, fell loosely across his forehead. He looked tired. A deep, bruising purple shadowed his slate-gray eyes, mirroring the exhaustion Rowan wore every day. Conrad didn't walk to the counter. He didn't look toward the corner booth where Libby was sleeping under his quilt. He kept his eyes meticulously trained on the floorboards as he walked to the smallest, wobbliest table in the farthest corner of the diner, near the restrooms. He sat down. He folded his large hands on the cracked formica, and he waited. Rowan's breath hitched in his throat. His fingers twitched toward the heavy ceramic mugs, the memory of shattered porcelain still fresh. "Lou!" he hissed over his shoulder. "Lou, he's back!" Lou pushed through the swinging doors, a tray of raw biscuits in her hands. She took one look at Conrad, then looked at Rowan's white-knuckled grip on the counter edge. She sighed, a long, rattling sound of a woman who had seen too many men make too many mistakes. "Is he causing a scene?" Lou asked, her voice low. "He's existing," Rowan bit back, his voice trembling. "Tell him to leave." "I run a business, Ro. If he orders, he eats. If he starts something, I'll hit him with the cast iron skillet myself." Lou grabbed a menu and a coffee pot. "Keep your eyes on the hash browns. They're burning." Rowan turned back to the grill, but his vision was swimming. His biology, the traitorous omega instincts he had spent years chemically burying, was practically screaming at him. Even across the room, even over the overpowering stench of frying bacon and bleach, he could feel the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. Conrad's scent was heavily suppressed, probably by his own sheer force of will, but the ambient frequency of an alpha in the room made the hair on Rowan's arms stand up. It was an agonizing contradiction. His mind wanted Conrad dead. His body, exhausted and starved of safety, felt an involuntary, microscopic release of tension just knowing an alpha was guarding the door. Rowan hated himself for it. He scrubbed at his neck patch until his nails came away with tiny flecks of blood. Lou came back behind the counter, slamming a $5 bill into the register. "Black coffee," said he doesn't want anything else. Conrad stayed for 2 hours. He didn't touch his phone. He didn't read a newspaper. He just wrapped his hands around the ceramic mug and stared out the greasy window at the pawn shop across the street. When the morning rush started filtering in, taking up tables, Conrad quietly stood up, placed a $50 bill under his saucer, and walked out without a backward glance. Rowan stared at the money. It felt dirty, radioactive. He walked over, picked up the crisp bill with 2 fingers, and threw it directly into the trash can behind the counter. The next morning, Conrad was back at 6 a.m. black coffee, the corner table, 2 hours of complete, statuesque silence, another $50 bill left under the cup, another bill tossed into the garbage by a shaking, furious Omega. This became the twisted rhythm of their lives. For 2 weeks, the siege continued. Conrad never approached the counter. He never spoke to Rowan. He never even looked in Libby's direction, treating the corner booth like a sacred perimeter he wasn't allowed to breach. He was simply a heavy, immovable object in Rowan's fragile orbit. Rowan was losing his mind. The anxiety was a living, breathing thing chewing on his stomach lining. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating the diner leftovers. He just watched Conrad, waiting for the trap to spring. You don't abandon a pregnant mate to build an empire, only to throw it away to drink burnt coffee in a slum. It was a strategy. It had to be a strategy. But as the days bled into weeks, the edges of Conrad's corporate armor began to rust. The expensive haircut grew shaggy. The calluses on his hands, once soft from typing and shaking hands, began to harden from whatever manual labor he was doing to pass the time in a city he didn't belong in. He wasn't trying to buy them out. He was trying to wear Rowan's hatred down by sheer, stubborn attrition. Friday nights at Lou's Diner were a specific circle of hell. The local factory let out at 5, flooding the small restaurant with loud, exhausted men wanting cheap beer and heavy food. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, sweat, and frying grease. The noise level was a physical pressure against the eardrums. Rowan was moving purely on muscle memory and adrenaline. His lower back was a screaming knot of agony. The scent blocker on his neck felt like a branding iron, burning into his skin as his stress levels spiked. At 7:30 p.m., the disaster struck. Rowan was carrying a heavy plastic bus tub full of dirty, syrup-crusted plates back to the kitchen. The linoleum was slick with spilled water from a leaky cooler. His worn-out boot hit the puddle. There was zero friction. His legs went out from under him. The world tilted in a dizzying blur. Rowan crashed hard onto his side. The bus tub flew from his hands, hitting the floor with a catastrophic, deafening crash. Thick ceramic plates shattered like shrapnel. A half-empty glass of sticky cherry cola exploded across the tiles. Pain shot up Rowan's hip, sharp and bright. He lay there for a second, the breath knocked entirely out of his lungs. The diner went dead silent. The low murmur of the factory workers abruptly stopped. "Papa?" The small, frightened voice came from the corner booth. Rowan scrambled to his knees, panic instantly overriding the pain. "I'm fine, Libby. Stay back. Don't step in the glass." He reached out with shaking hands, blindly trying to gather the jagged shards of a broken plate. His vision was blurring with frustrated, humiliated tears. He just wanted to crawl into a hole. He wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. "Don't touch that." The voice was a low, commanding rumble. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence of the diner like a heavy blade. Rowan froze. A shadow fell over him. Conrad was suddenly kneeling on the floor beside him. He had crossed the room in seconds, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that made the drunk factory workers instinctively lean back in their booths. Up close, Conrad smelled like damp concrete, rain, and the faint, bitter tang of raw regret. He didn't look at Rowan's face. He just reached out and clamped his large, warm hand directly over Rowan's shaking wrist, stopping him from grabbing a sharp piece of porcelain. The contact was an electric shock. It had been 4 years since Conrad had touched him. The heat of the Alpha's palm bled right through Rowan's cheap sleeve, sinking straight into his bones. A terrifying, humiliating whimper built in the back of Rowan's throat. His Omega biology, starved and beaten down, practically violently sobbed at the touch. "Safe." His body screamed. "Alpha." "Safe." Rowan yanked his arm back violently, his chest heaving. "Get off me." Conrad dropped his hand immediately, holding his palms up in a gesture of surrender. "Your hands are shaking, Rowan. You're going to cut yourself to ribbons." "I don't care. It's none of your business. Go back to your table." Rowan's voice was a jagged whisper. He tried to grab the plastic tub, but his fingers slipped on the sticky soda. "Move," Conrad said softly. It wasn't an order. It was a plea. Without waiting for permission, Conrad shifted his weight, putting himself entirely between Rowan and the worst of the broken glass. He ignored the sticky cherry cola soaking into the knees of his denim jeans. With calm, methodical precision, Conrad began picking up the sharpest pieces of debris, stacking them neatly into the unbroken corner of the tub. Rowan knelt frozen in the spilled soda, staring at the side of Conrad's face. A muscle ticked rapidly in the Alpha's jaw. His hands, large, strong, and terrifyingly gentle, moved through the wreckage, doing the dirty work so Rowan wouldn't have to. It was a mundane action, cleaning up dropped plates, but the sheer intimacy of it, an Alpha kneeling in the dirt, ruining his clothes to protect his mate's hands from a minor cut, was a devastating blow to Rowan's defenses. It was exactly the kind of grounded, ugly, necessary care Conrad had refused to give him 4 years ago. "Why are you doing this?" Rowan breathed, the words slipping out before he could bite his tongue. "You're a corporate lawyer. You don't pick up garbage." Conrad stopped. He was holding a jagged piece of a coffee mug, the sharp edge pressed dangerously into his thumb. He slowly turned his head to look at Rowan. The proximity was suffocating. The icy, slate-gray eyes were entirely stripped of their usual armor. They were wide, raw, and shimmering with an agonizingly unguarded sorrow. "I'm not a lawyer anymore," Conrad said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register that vibrated in Rowan's chest. "I quit." Rowan's breath hitched. "What?" "I quit, Ro. I left the firm. I surrendered the apartment." Conrad looked down at the broken glass in his hand. "I don't have an empire anymore. I burned it down, because I realized a week ago that I'm sitting in a glass tower, and the only things in this world that have any real value are scrubbing floors in a diner I wouldn't have looked twice at. Rowan felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His reality was warping, the ground shifting under his feet. "You're lying. You're trying to manipulate me." "I have no right to ask you to believe me," Conrad murmured, dropping the glass into the tub. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't get that. I'm going to sit in that corner every single day and make sure you're safe. That's it. That's all I want." "Excuse me." The tiny piping voice made them both freeze. Rowan turned his head. Libby had slipped out of his booth. The 4-year-old was standing 2 feet away, clutching his ratty blue blanket against his chest. He was looking directly at Conrad with those identical, piercing, slate-gray eyes. Conrad stopped breathing. His broad shoulders went completely rigid. He looked at the boy like he was looking at an angel that had just landed in the sticky soda. "You missed a piece," Libby said, his tone entirely serious. He pointed a tiny finger at a shard of glass hidden under the edge of the counter. Conrad swallowed audibly. The sound was thick, painful. He slowly reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and picked up the piece of glass. "Thank you," Conrad whispered, his voice cracking violently in the middle of the word. "Good eye, buddy." Libby nodded, satisfied. He didn't seem afraid of the large alpha. He just looked at him with a quiet, analytical curiosity, then turned and padded back to his booth. Conrad squeezed his eyes shut. A single, heavy tear escaped, tracking a clean line through the dust and sweat on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just picked up the heavy plastic tub, stood up, and carried the wreckage to the back kitchen, leaving Rowan kneeling on the floor, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying new rhythm against his ribs. The ice hadn't shattered, but for the first time in 4 years, there was a microscopic, undeniable crack. Tuesday arrived with a dull, throbbing ache behind Rowan's eyes that tasted vaguely of metal. He had ignored the warning signs for 3 days. The burning, localized entirely around the scent gland on his neck, had evolved from a sharp itch to a deep, radiating heat. 4 years of slapping cheap industrial-grade adhesive blockers over his most sensitive skin had finally collected the debt. His body was violently rejecting the chemicals, punishing him for burying his own nature. Rowan stood at the diner's grill, staring at a pool of cracking eggs. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a frequency that felt like a drill bit sinking into his temple. His hands shook. He tried to grip the metal spatula, but his fingers felt thick and uncoordinated, like they belonged to someone else. He was sweating. Not the usual humid sheen of working a hot kitchen, but a cold, clammy film that stuck his gray t-shirt to his spine. "Ro, you're burning the yolks." Lou's voice sounded miles away, distorted as if she were shouting underwater. Rowan blinked. The edges of his vision were darkening, shrinking into a narrow tunnel. He reached up, his knuckles brushing the edge of the flesh-colored patch on his neck. The skin underneath was blistering, radiating a sickening, feverish heat. Rowan started, but his tongue was too heavy. He didn't finish the sentence. The linoleum floor rushed up to meet him. He didn't hit the ground. A heavy, solid force collided with his side, catching him under the armpits before his knees could slam into the tiles. The sudden movement jostled the air, and instantly, Rowan's failing senses were swallowed by the smell of crushed pine needles, damp earth, and sheer, unfiltered panic. Conrad. The alpha had vaulted the counter again. Rowan's cheeks slumped against a broad, muscular shoulder clad in a rough cotton Henley. It was humiliating. Rowan wanted to shove him away, to bare his teeth and demand to be put down, but his muscles were liquid. "Rowan! Hey, look at me," Conrad ordered, his voice a tight, low rumble that vibrated directly against Rowan's chest. Rowan's eyelids fluttered. He saw the sharp angle of Conrad's jaw, the tense lines bracketing his mouth. The alpha's slate-gray eyes were blown wide, the dark limbal rings stark against his pale skin. "Get his apron off!" Lou barked, suddenly there, her hands moving with frantic efficiency. "He's been looking like a corpse all morning. It's that damn patch. He's reacting to it." Conrad didn't hesitate. His large fingers, surprisingly deft, unknotted the stained apron strings. He didn't ask for permission. He shifted his grip, sliding one arm under Rowan's knees and the other across his back, lifting him off the greasy floor as effortlessly as if Rowan were made of paper. "Where does he live?" Conrad asked, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. It was the voice of a man who used to tear apart hostile witness testimonies for a living. "2 blocks down, the brick walk-up above the old laundromat," Lou said. She looked at the corner booth. Libby was standing up, his small hands pressed flat against the red vinyl, his eyes wide with silent terror. "I'll keep the boy here until my shift is done. Go." "No," Rowan forced out, a pathetic wet sound. He tried to weakly grab at Conrad's shirt collar. Don't take my son." "I'm not taking him anywhere, Ro," Conrad said softly, adjusting his hold. He looked over at the little boy. The resemblance still hit him like a physical blow to the sternum. "Libby, buddy, Papa is just sick. I'm going to take him home so he can rest. Miss Lou is going to make you some pancakes, okay?" Libby stared at Conrad. The boy's piercing eyes darted from the tall alpha to his father's limp form. Slowly, Libby gave a single microscopic nod. He trusted Lou. And, bizarrely, his young instincts didn't scream at him to run from the man carrying his father. Conrad carried Rowan out the back door, stepping into the muggy alleyway. The heat of the afternoon sun hit them, but Rowan was shivering violently, his teeth clicking together. The walk to the apartment was a blur of cracked pavement and the smell of exhaust. Rowan kept fading in and out of consciousness. Every time he surfaced, he was hyper-aware of the steady rhythmic thud of Conrad's heartbeat against his ear. It was a cruel biological trick. His brain hated this man, but his fever-addled Omega biology was weeping with relief, finally surrounded by the dominant, protective scent of a mate. Conrad kicked the heavy wooden door of the apartment building open and carried Rowan up 2 flights of rotting, carpeted stairs. "Keys," Conrad muttered, shifting Rowan slightly. Rowan blindly fumbled in his denim pocket, his numb fingers dragging a single brass key out. Conrad took it, unlocking the chip door and kicking it open. Conrad stepped inside and stopped dead. Rowan forced his eyes open, tracking Conrad's gaze. He watched the alpha process the reality of the room, the cramped, windowless studio, the peeling yellow wallpaper, the rusted hot plate on the counter, and worst of all, the small, sagging cot pushed into the corner, covered in a faded blue quilt. It was a physical manifestation of poverty, a monument to 4 years of suffering. Conrad's jaw clamped shut so hard Rowan heard the teeth grind. A wave of suffocating guilt and self-loathing rolled off the alpha, souring his pine scent with the bitter tang of ozone. But Conrad didn't say a word. He walked over to the second-hand mattress on the floor and gently laid Rowan down. "You're burning up," Conrad said, his voice stripped of all its corporate polish. He sounded raw, broken. He went to the tiny kitchenette, running the faucet until the pipes groaned. He came back with a damp, clean dish towel. "Rowan," Conrad said softly, kneeling beside the mattress, "I have to take the patch off. It's poisoning you." Rowan flinched, curling in on himself. "No. They'll smell me." "Nobody's coming in here," Conrad said. The words were quiet, but laced with a lethal, absolute certainty. "I'll break the jaw of anyone who tries. Let me take it off." Rowan was too weak to fight. He let his head roll to the side, exposing the inflamed, angry red skin of his neck. Conrad's fingers were agonizingly gentle. He found the edge of the thick adhesive and began to peel it back. Even with his care, the ripping sound was loud in the quiet room. Rowan hissed, a tear leaking from the corner of his eye as the raw skin was exposed to the air. The moment the patch came completely off, the room changed. 4 years of suppressed pheromones flooded the tiny apartment. It wasn't the sweet, light scent of cedar and honey that Conrad remembered from their youth. It was heavy, dark, and bruised. It smelled like ancient, petrified wood and fermented honey. It was the scent of an Omega who had survived a war. Conrad squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving as he absorbed the scent. He He carefully pressed the cool, damp towel against the blistered gland. Rowan gasped at the sudden relief, his rigid muscles finally, involuntarily going slack. "Sleep," Conrad whispered, brushing a damp, sweat-soaked curl from Rowan's forehead. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in over 1,400 days, Rowan closed his eyes and actually believed it. Sunlight bled through the crack in the cheap vinyl blinds, casting a harsh yellow line across the scuffed floorboards. Rowan woke up by degrees. The fever had broken. He felt hollowed out, entirely drained of fluid and energy, but the suffocating pressure in his skull was gone. The skin on his neck throbbed with a dull ache, but the fiery burning had receded. He slowly pushed himself up on his elbows. The apartment was quiet. He turned his head. Sitting on a rickety wooden dining chair pulled next to the mattress was Conrad. The Alpha was asleep. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed. He looked terrible. His gray Henley was wrinkled and stained with sweat. Dark, bruised bags hung heavily under his eyes. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night fighting off invisible demons in a dark room. On the small kitchen counter, a cheap plastic humidifier that Rowan didn't own was humming quietly, pumping cool moisture into the dry air. Next to it sat a brown paper pharmacy bag and a brand new box of children's crayons. Rowan stared at the Alpha. The anger, the white-hot, protective rage that had fueled him for 4 years, was still there. It hadn't magically evaporated just because Conrad wiped his forehead with a wet rag. The betrayal was etched into Rowan's bones. But looking at Conrad now, stripped of his arrogance, his wealth, and his ambition, the anger felt different. It felt less like a weapon and more like a heavy shield he was getting too tired to hold up. "You snore." Rowan's voice was a cracked whisper, loud in the silent room. Conrad jerked awake. His slate-gray eyes snapped open, instantly alert, scanning the room for a threat before locking onto Rowan. The relief that washed over his face was profound, softening the harsh, tired lines of his jaw. Conrad leaned back in the chair, running a heavy hand through his messy hair. "Only when I sleep in a wooden chair that was designed as a torture device." Rowan didn't smile. He pulled the thin sheet up to his chest, suddenly hyper-aware of the heavy scent of pine and ozone mixing with his own dark cedar in the small room. It felt intimate. It felt dangerous. "Where is Libby?" Rowan asked, his protective instincts flaring. "Lose," Conrad answered quickly. "I went over at 6 a.m., gave her money for his breakfast. She said she'd keep him in the back office playing with her old typewriter until you were up. I didn't want to bring him back here while you were unconscious. I didn't want to scare him." Rowan slowly processed that. It was a thoughtful, entirely practical decision. It was the decision of a parent. The realization made Rowan's throat tighten. "You can't just buy your way into his life, Conrad," Rowan said. His voice lacked its usual venom, sounding just utterly exhausted. "You can't buy him crayons and act like the last 4 years didn't happen." "I know," Conrad said quietly. He didn't flinch. He didn't try to defend himself. He looked directly into Rowan's eyes. "I know I can't fix it. I'm not asking you to let me move in. I'm not asking you to pretend you don't hate me. You have every right to despise me until the day I die." Conrad leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees again. His scent spiked, a sharp, earnest wave of clean earth. "But I am his father, and I am your Alpha. I denied both of those things because I was a terrified, selfish coward who thought ambition was the same thing as worth. I was wrong." Rowan swallowed hard. The absolute, unvarnished honesty in Conrad's voice was tearing down his defenses faster than aggression ever could. "I took a job," Conrad continued, his gaze unwavering. "Shipping logistics down at the rail yard. It's manual labor. It pays enough to rent a small place 2 streets over. I start Monday. I'm setting up an account for child support. You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to look at me. But I am going to make sure he has winter boots, and I am going to make sure you never have to put another one of those toxic patches on your skin ever again." Rowan stared at him. The sheer absurdity of it, a former corporate shark moving boxes in a rail yard just to breathe the same polluted air as them, was staggering. "Why?" Rowan asked, a single tear finally escaping, tracing a hot path down his pale cheek. "Why now? Why did you throw your whole life away for a ghost you didn't even want?" Conrad reached out. He stopped an inch from Rowan's hand resting on the mattress, hovering his fingers there, asking for permission without speaking. Rowan stared at the large, calloused hand. He took a shaky breath and slowly, deliberately, rotated his wrist, brushing his knuckles against Conrad's fingertips. Conrad exhaled a shuddering breath, wrapping his hand gently around Rowan's. "Because," Conrad whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I walked into a diner, and a little boy looked at me with my exact eyes. And I realized my life didn't mean a damn thing if I wasn't the man looking back at him." They sat in silence. There was no sweeping declaration of love, no magical erasure of the eviction notices, the lonely nights, or the agonizing labor in a county hospital. The ledger was still horribly unbalanced, but as Conrad's thumb gently stroked the back of Rowan's bruised hand, the scent of dark cedar and honey slowly, cautiously, began to intertwine with the deep grounding smell of pine. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was jagged, scarred, and built on the ruins of a massive mistake. But as Rowan closed his eyes and listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside him, he knew one thing for certain. The severance was over. The roots were finally taking hold. If the raw reality of Rowan and Conrad's fractured bond struck a chord with you, you're not alone. We love exploring stories that don't shy away from the ugly, imperfect sides of love, survival, and redemption. True healing isn't a fairy tale. It's messy, exhausting, and completely human. If you felt every jagged edge of this Omegaverse drama, hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who appreciates a grounded, deeply emotional narrative. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense, character-driven stories. Your support keeps these raw worlds alive.